Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If you can take your seats, please. Good morning. Welcome to Automotive Logistics Europe 2015. My name's Louis Yakumi, and I'm the founder and publisher of the Automotive Logistics Group. It's always a pleasure to be back here and looking out at the audience. It's also great to make sure that I'm not the oldest person in the room and definitely not the worst looking in the room. So thank you very much for helping my confidence. Amongst the topics, amongst the topics we'll discuss over the next 2 days will be the future of automotive industry and the future of the logistics industry. And perhaps it might look a little bit like this. So we're going to be looking at driverless trucks, driverless cars. If we can get to an area where we can have automotive logistics without any people at all, I think that will be an industry that might actually work for once. The headlines around the European automotive industry are positive. Not super positive, but positive nonetheless. So it's good to see that, the signs of growth coming back. But what we need to do is be more proactive and to think about the future. Sometimes, we need to think about what's important as opposed to what seems to be urgent. We're forever running around trying to fix yesterday's problems, the day before's problems. The automotive logistics industry has got a reputation for being great in crises, but perhaps we need to start looking forward and start thinking of what's going to make a difference in the future. And three of the factors that will play a big part of that, and that's the theme of our conference, is going to be people, processes, and technology. So the areas that will affect us are going to start being the new mobility models, the new electric drivetrains, the new markets that we'll be entering, new risk factors, government initiatives, environmental concerns. These are all things that will play a big part, and we have to be proactive and be prepared for those. And over the next 2 days, we'll hear about all of those. Plus, of course, we will still look at today's problems as well. We're also delighted at the conference this year. We'll look at things a little bit differently as well. Our guest speaker at the gala dinner tonight is Chris Bangle, the former BMW design chief, who's always got interesting and controversial views on the designs of new vehicles. We're also delighted that we've got one of the newer entrants into the automotive industry. We haven't quite got Google cars here or anything like that, but we'll have Amazon telling us what they're doing for the aftermarket industry. Also for the conference this year, perhaps something new that I said at the beginning of our conference is please turn your mobile phones on. Running through the 2 days is Automotive Logistics Live. That's sponsored by Sovereign this year. But please use your smartphones and your tablets to take advantage of this great new feature. You'll find more details about it in the inside back cover of the brochure. And by logging onto the internet, you can take part of or be a part of Automotive Logistics Live, with which you can direct message other delegates. You can ask questions or make comments that we can read on the stage. You can join the voting surveys that will happen later on this afternoon. And the main sessions are also being streamed live around the world. So if you have to pop out for just for a few minutes, you can still watch the conference as it's going on live. And you can also see, you can also see the conference or the main sessions of the conference after the conference as well. Starting from tomorrow, you can see today's sessions again. A thank you as always to some of the most important people at our conference, who are our sponsors. Our gold sponsors: CHEP, DSV, Evolution, Jeffco, KHS, Priority Freight and Sovereign. Our global sponsors were CTM Law and Wallenius Wilhelmsen Logistics. They're called our global sponsors because they actually sponsor all of our conferences around the world. And our silver sponsors: ARS Altman, BLG, Evels Cargo Care, FedEx, Flexis, Geodis, Goodpack, Inform, Orbis, Proact, Swiss Post, TNT and UTI. They sponsor the conference because they believe they've got services, products, knowledge, people who can help you in the work that you do. So please visit their stands, read their literature, meet their people, and see what they're doing, see what they can offer. You'd be very surprised at the solutions that you'll find just by walking around the little square outside. You also might want to visit the KHS stand, where they're doing some live repairs on a vehicle. Why they didn't just bring a perfect vehicle in the first place and they wouldn't have to fix anything, I can't understand. But they brought one in with dents in it, so I suppose they have to fix it. So please visit that as well. As usual, our format is presentations first, and then the questions at the end. After the 2 or 3 or 4 presentations, then the questions will be at the end of those. The presentations will be, or a link to the presentations will be emailed to you at the end of the conference. And as always, we're very aware of, we've been very fortunate putting some great sessions, some great speakers, some great panels together over the next 2 days, but we're very aware of, amongst the benefits of the conference, or perhaps the biggest benefit of the conference, is the networking. So please take advantage of that time during the coffee breaks, the tea breaks, the dinners tonight, the lunches, to talk to each other. Be open, be prepared to talk to others. There's no point being shy at an industry event. And be open to others talking to you. That's how the industry is going to improve. It's not going to be by one guy coming up with a fantastic idea. It's going to come from everybody working together. So I'd like to start off the conference, the opening session, to look at what's happening ahead in our industry. We're going to be looking at it from an automotive perspective and a logistics perspective, from 2 analysts to give us their views and projections on what your industry is going to look like in the next few years. So the first speaker of the day, the first speaker of Automotive Logistics Europe, I'd like to welcome to the podium Christoph Stürmer, the Global Lead Analyst for PwC Autofacts. Thank you very much, Christoph. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louis. Good morning, everybody. And Louis, I hope that thing about the age was not about my gray beard. So, the most difficult slot, there are 2 difficult slots in a conference. One is the one directly in the morning, and the one is the one after lunch. So, let's see how we get through the first difficulty of the day to start off. And first thing I have to admit is I'm not a logistics guy. I'm the auto guy here. And as we were talking yesterday evening, someone said, "Oh, you're from PwC. You count things." Yes, we do. Some of my colleagues count, do the bookkeeping, and some are legal advisors, and some are actually consultants. And PwC as a company has made great strides to improve their advisory practice. So just last year, a company called Booz & Company was acquired, now rebranded to Strategy and Kundus, who are providers who are one of the they claim. World-leading providers of business information systems are now also part of the fold. And my group, Autofacts, is a group that is independent, an independent analyst and forecaster of the automotive industry, both provides the services into the PwC group as well as to any one of you. And we concentrate on the automotive industry from a production perspective. So in terms of finished vehicle logistics, what we forecast in great detail is where to actually pick up cars, not where to deliver them. That's what other forecasters do, but we're mostly concerned about where the vehicles will be produced. And actually, 2015 looks, to our analysis, looks like another bumper year for the automotive industry. So our current global production forecast stands at plus 5.7% for the automotive industry, which is almost 5 million units additional production. And maybe when we look at the automotive industry, it is sometimes a good idea to not just look at relative growth rates, but to really look at absolute number of cars that are being produced and that are being shipped around. The largest producer of cars that we had in 2014 as a single country was China, with about 22 million cars produced, with a particular challenge that all Chinese factories are landlocked. So they cannot just directly put cars on ships, but they always have to be hauled around using, streets or trains. In China, we're expecting a growth of 10% this year. So more than 2 million additional cars built in China alone this year. The rest of Asia is also sort of coming back in terms of production. North America is interesting. I just talked to the North American analyst in the last few days, and it's really, North America has been going through this elevator movement after the crisis, and it's now basically hit the ceiling. The factories that used to be closed, some of them have been reopened, capacity has been reinstalled, and the big movement that we see, and Christopher, you were visiting there, is a big shift of capacity basically out of Canada and into Mexico. So we have a bit of a rebalancing in North America, and I don't know, Volkswagen just yesterday announced that they'll have another product in the huge Puebla plant with all the difficult logistics around the plant, both in and out, so that's going to make it even harder around there. And in Europe, and I think this is what we're looking at in this moment, even in Europe, we're expecting production to continue to rise as the European markets continue to rise. So for our sales forecast in Europe, we are expecting a growth of almost 3%, which is sort of a very conservative outlook. It may go a little bit better, but production in Europe, as you can see, we have a current estimate of about 5% additional production in Europe, almost evenly distributed over all the manufacturers. If we look at this, and I think the purpose of this discussion is also to look a bit more long-term, this compares production in 2014 to what we expect production to be in 2021, which is 7 years out, which is sort of one deep breath in the automotive industry. Of course, most of the growth is going to come from China, another 10 million vehicles produced in China on top of what they're already producing between last year and 2021. Growth coming from Europe, growth coming in total from North America, but also India. We still have high hopes, and it seems that the Modi government is sort of sorting their way out to fixing some of the deep structural problems of India. ASEAN is still on the list. And then last but not least, of course, Russia is in a very sorry state at the moment. but we think that there's going to be resilience in the economy that's going to take Russia back to become one of the more important European markets by the end of the decade. How is this growth going to look? And I think in a logistics environment, it's also not about how much, but it's also where as a big question. And if we look at global automotive production, we can see that, well, being in Germany, of course, we count German cars first, and currently it is the case that 7% of global light vehicle production is located in Germany. Only 7%. Well, in Europe outside of Germany, it's 15% of global production. In North America, it's 17% of global production. In China, it is already 21% of global production. But all the rest, and that's a pretty big place, unites 40% of global production. And when we look at this over time, the relative importance of China is going to be the main driver of shifts of global production, of course. And this big shift into China in terms of global production, it will dwarf the rest of the shifts. But what I would still like to remind you of is that there is production outside of North America, EU, and China. And it is really, really important. And it will keep up with global developments. In terms of new plants, new factories, we're currently counting, this is of course just a focus on the German OEMs. There's a lot of, and this is just vehicle plants. This is not powertrain plants. So we think there's one additional plant coming up for the VW Group in Poland that most of you are already aware of. There are 4 plants that we currently have in China on the books. There may be some more on the horizon, depending on the capacity usage. If the additional capacity that is needed by the German OEMs in China will be installed in existing facilities or in additional facilities, that are decisions that sometimes are taken with a bit of a shorter view. But the interesting thing is that in the rest of the world, like many other places, we are seeing additional factories come up even by the German manufacturers. And this is just an example. I could make this French manufacturers, I could make this US manufacturers. It's going to be a pretty similar picture. So what does this do in terms of global picture? Globalization is there to stay, and it will just continue to be a challenge for everybody around. The next big feature is the number of variants and vehicle model lines that companies are producing is going to relentlessly increase. And the number of new models on tap, in ramp-up, is one of the great variations. That is one of the big volatility producers in the automotive industry. So a new model will create new tooling in the factory, it will create new processes, it will come up with ramp-up management, it will come up with new distribution networks. And what we've done here is we've divided the number of total cars produced. We made a relationship of the number of new cars in production, like in recent production, either start year or first year of production, as compared to the total number of cars. And we're seeing that in 2014, for example, more than 1/3 of new cars of Daimler were cars that were either in their first year or were just in ramp-up. So in terms of expecting this industry ever to come to a steady state, forget it. There is no steady state in the automotive industry. There's always the life cycle that in the beginning pumps up volume, and then you will have declining volumes for every model. But here we see that automotive manufacturers are making it a strategy to have vehicles in ramp-up. So the ramp-up in the future is not going to be an exception, but is the normal state of operations. There will be ramp-ups relentlessly, everywhere, every year, in every factory. In terms of how many different models will actually be in ramp-up, the word is still out. And this is a very interesting discussion that we're following. Some manufacturers just keep hammering and just keep inventing new variants, new variations, and maybe Chris Bangle tonight will have a couple of interesting ideas what still to invent in terms of new vehicle concepts, new vehicle ideas. Other manufacturers are sort of at the end of their wits in terms of complexity. And when we look at the way that Fiat, for example, has consolidated, has slashed their product portfolio over the last 5 years, really shrunk it down, PSA has announced a similar strategy. So let's see. It's not quite clear in terms of total product variation where it's going to go. I think for the premium manufacturers, we're pretty safe to say that for premium, additional models mean additional sales. We're not quite sure yet for the more humble brands what that's going to be. But it's a big thing because it's about complexity. How much complexity can the automotive industry handle in terms of model lines? When you look at vehicle specifications, of course the complexity is already tremendous, and I think that leads to other topics that we'll discuss in a second. The other big thing in the automotive industry, and maybe this is just for your information, of course, is the big struggle to reduce the CO2 output of their products, of their cars. Most of that load, of course, is borne by the powertrain technologies. And maybe just to give you a couple of keywords, you're probably seeing the same in your lorries. So engines get smaller, engines get turbochargers. There's also the strategy of what is called down speeding. So if you remember back in the old times, when you had a high-performance engine, it was always a high-revving engine. So top output would be at very high revs. When today you look at your trucks, their peak output would be at very low revs. And this is also a strategy that increasingly the automotive is followed for light vehicles in terms of bringing down the top revs of the engines, still having the same performance, and this is where hybrid strategies come to bear. This is point number 2, so the combination of a combustion engine and some sort of electric powertrain is going to be very interesting. And just yesterday, I think there's a delegate here and even a speaker from Tesla. I think the very handling of high voltage technology is an interesting challenge that some of you are already facing. Then, of course, things get lighter. And we were just talking about cars with dents. It's an entirely different thing to have a dent in an aluminum sheet than in a steel sheet. So all these lightweight technologies, and God forbid, when a carbon structure gets dented, you throw it away, which is not so nice in terms of damage and claim management. And the final thing is, of course, modular strategies. So if those of you who are working with Volvo, you better buy your last 6-cylinder Volvo or your last 8-cylinder Volvo, because they will be out of production very, very soon. There will only be 4-cylinder engines produced by Volvo in the future. So this is a very drastic example of how technologies will be consolidated and turned, instead of producing a great variety of architectures, will be consolidated into, let's say, modular systems. The amount of alternative drivetrain vehicles to transport, we're still looking at forecasts that are about 5-6% of global market share in the future. but with very high local densities. So when you look at California, when you look at some places in Japan, when you look at some northern European markets, they are full of alternative drivetrain vehicles. Other markets seem to be pretty scared by them. So 5% of the global automotive manufacturing is still more than 5 million cars that come with alternative drivetrain technologies in the future. And some of this pressure also is, of course, on the transporter side. So this, I think, now we're sort of getting more to the abstract level. And in earlier times, I think the service provider was someone who was basically available for direct calls, direct orders. So someone in the automotive value chain, be it a supplier, be it an OEM, be it a distributor, had a transportation need, picked up the phone, called the logistics guy, placed an order, the logistics guy would come and would do the order. Simple, one-to-one relationship. I have a need, I get a service. This is no longer the case, and it has been sort of the case in a very rapidly decreasing way, that today there are very many relationships between the supplier and the OEM and the distributor that would not work without the service provider in between. So the service provider today is not an order taker, but is an integrated part of the automotive value chain. And this, of course, has many more consequences than just having to pick up the phone when someone calls. It needs, and I think you've all seen that, you've all become specialists in the automotive industry in addition to being specialists in logistics. So it requires a much deeper understanding of what your client is about today and what your client will be about tomorrow and what your client's clients will be about today and tomorrow, rather than just do the job that you're doing. And I would like to continue on this, because being the intermediary between the OEM, the suppliers, and the distributors means also that you can be part of the increasing amount of value that the OEM is no longer covering within the automotive value chain. The share of OEM value add in the total value chain is decreasing year over year over year, which on the other hand means that everybody else in the value chain, including the service providers, have the opportunity to cover a wider share of the value chain. So not only is the automotive industry growing in terms of producing more cars, it is also the case that service providers, suppliers, and distributors get a bigger share of the total automotive value chain. Plus, cars get more complicated. So there are more parts to ship, more service to do, more distribution to do. So it's a sort of a triple added effect in terms of operating, in terms of making a long-term business strategy when you're operating in the automotive industry as a service provider. And here's just a couple of outside ideas from an analyst perspective, what we've been thinking about. And at PwC, in the advisory, we're doing a lot with data. To us, data, big data, is, let's say, it's the new oil. We have a data rush. We virtually have a data rush in the industry. Everybody is trying to understand what to do with data. And maybe it is, it's an interesting exercise, but maybe we could go deeper in this to try to think of logistics processes not with the good at the center, but with the data at the center, to sort of flip them around from the inside out or from the outside in, and look at the flow of logistics from a data flow perspective, and then try to understand what that means in terms of the services you can put around them. And what I would like to just highlight with this graphic is that I come to understand logistics as a whole logistics universe. It is not just the transportation bit. but it is everything that moves, all the movements that the automotive industry requires of people, of parts, pieces, vehicles, materials. They flow into the factory, they get processed in the industry, they flow out of the factory. They do that within the factory, they do that within the compound, within the location of the OEM. They do that on the national level or on a continental level. They do it internationally or intercontinentally. So it is an entire logistics universe that I think is the playground for a logistics service provider. And the other thing that we also look at, we don't just count cars in the Autofacts group, but we also count engines and transmissions as examples of parts. And the flows of engine and transmissions into cars and together with cars are hugely interesting. And when we just look at all the services that are needed to keep those things moving, it is absolutely fantastic. Just 2 weeks ago, I was on a quality manager conference. And there are companies in the quality universe that do things that look suspiciously similar to what some of you guys do in the logistics universe. So what do? They do packing, they do sealing, they do preparation of things for transport. They do collecting things. Also all the documentation, quality control, examination of parts, of products. They store stuff. You can store stuff. Sequence parts. For example, I mean, in the automotive industry, all of you know on the inbound side, it is all about just in time, just in sequence. Some suppliers just don't do that. They package stuff as it comes out of their production shop. And then they let a service provider do the sequencing for them, the pre-configuring. Of course, many logistics providers already do pre-assembly, storage. And at the end, it's all about documentation and disposition. So I think that, for me, from an outside perspective, it wouldn't, since the OEMs are handing out more and more interconnected pieces of the automotive value chain, it may make a lot of sense to try to find business models that also work in an interconnected fashion, that not just provide one piece of service, but that provide a whole piece of the value chain. So I'm looking at transport, information, and handling as integrated parts of services that an OEM may need. And instead of putting the word OEM in the middle as your client, I think we could also put the word data in the middle, because this whole logistics universe that I think could be a vision circles around data, knowing what it is that we're handling, knowing what to do next, and being able to provide a good, concise report of what it is that has been done. So thank you very much for listening to this outside perspective. I look very much forward to discussing this in the next few minutes. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christoph. A great opening presentation. Love the positivity in Europe and the big growth globally. And of course, with this growth globally and the complexity that you discussed, the importance of you in the audience, the automotive logistics industry already become really an integrated part of the automotive value chain. To look more now from a logistics perspective, logistics and transportation perspective, I'd like to welcome to the podium Thomas Cullen, the Chief Analyst for Transport Intelligence.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know if this mic works. Okay. Louis, the reason that I'm here generally is that Louis likes to sort of spice things up a bit, wake people up, and he hopes that I'll say something very, very controversial and very, very exciting, which I did last time, several years ago, about 3 or 4 years ago, more than that, and people started to throw rocks at me, and they didn't forgive me, so I learned from that. So my objective in this presentation is to start off, for most of the presentation, as boring as possible, and hopefully it will put people to sleep for 3/4 of the presentation, and they won't notice the couple of slides at the end, which are very, very slightly controversial, although I don't think very controversial. So we'll start off. Just a quick explanation about TI. Transport Intelligence is an organisation that generates information about markets, specifically, obviously, logistics markets. We advise lots of people, but particularly what we're focused. Yes, we do consultancy, but we're particularly focused on consultancy, which is based on good quality data, which, by the way, is often extraordinarily hard to get hold of. It's often very difficult to find out what you're actually talking about. What I will do today is, as I say, for the boring part, is to look at the sorts of information, the sorts of intelligence about markets that people so often ask us for. So what they're really interested in, customers all over around the world, in all types of sectors, not just the automotive sector, the oil industry, retailing, whatever, is how much should I be paying for my logistics? How much should I be paying for my freight transport? I want to just explore what the present market for those types of services is, what the trends are, what the demand trends are, and give you a few numbers around that. So I think in summary, sort of executive summary, is that we do have demand, but it's very slow. It's not, unsurprisingly, as bad as it was in 2010. We had a big bounce back and so forth, an enormous amount of volatility. There is still volatility out there, but actually underlying demand is very muted, and that there is, across, I would say, certainly most, almost, I would say almost all markets, there is an oversupply that really is damping down prices and indeed margins for all types of people, or most types of people operating in the logistics sector. Good for customers, not perhaps so good for logistics companies. Okay, global demand. Okay, if we look here, this is a chart showing us retail demand. Mr. Sturmer was saying very interesting things about growth in China and how China is motoring ahead. And if we look at this graph is showing us that China was growing in terms of retail demand, retail sales. It was growing by more than 20% a year back in 2009. And of course, now what we've had is a gradual fall, steady fall. Of course, it's still growing. I mean, it's almost in double figures. It's still huge, but I think the implications of that graph are fairly clear. The US has recovered somewhat. Retail sales are pretty decent, growing by 3 or 4% a year, perhaps. It's not setting the world alight, but it's noticeable that the US is now creeping up the graph in terms of overall demand and driving demand. Of course, a huge market. We see Europe, again, as ever, the description of Europe is somewhat difficult because, of course, what's driving demand are two big economies, the UK and Germany. The rest of Europe, if you were to take that out, is horrible. So now I know that there's a recovery in car sales in all sorts of markets. France is no longer quite so bad as it was, and so on and so forth. But we can see from the wider retailing picture, it's not really that exciting. Okay? One of the core KPIs, if you like, of the market is semiconductor production. As you can see there, semiconductor production, which you, bearing in mind, it's one of the most dynamic sectors of the economy. It's not taking off. It's respectable in terms of its growth, but as you can see there, that in the past quarter or so, that has flattened out. And if you look at Asia Pacific, it's actually less in terms of the speed of its growth than the world as a whole. and even the Americas isn't that exciting. So it's really, as again Mr. Sturman was saying, that there are other parts of the world that are growing quite respectably and or at least moderately respectably. And in this case, they're sort of keeping up the performance. But again, Asia Pacific, okay, that includes several major economies, both Japan and China, which are very different. But again, it's not hugely exciting. This is a PMI that we use, that TI and the American investment bank Stifel Nicolaus designed for the for the whole logistics sector. The red line is, I say, reality, basically over 50 and you're growing. It's just like all the PMIs. If you're over 50, you're growing. Under 50, you're shrinking. So it's pretty good, except what we see, of course, is that the reality, as ever, is often much less than expressions. Let's put hope there, expressions for the future. And that black line is what companies think, LSPs think the next quarter of growth will be, and it's been consistently over-optimistic. We can see a falling away of optimism, possibly seasonal, but overall it's quite reasonable. We're not in recession, but the reality is that it's less perhaps happy than everybody wants it to be. That might be one of the reasons why people are oversupplying the market so much. But again, container volumes, a core indicator of global trade growth. Still, these are figures of the number of TEUs. In fact, it's been chopped off there on the side, but that's the number of TEUs being moved through the key container ports in the world that we take those numbers, agglomerate them, and come up with the gross figures. And we can see there that it's by the way, ignore when it crashes, that's after Christmas coming out. It's when all the plastic Santa Claus stop coming out of Shenzhen. But we can see that it's steadily on the uptick, which you would think would be pretty sound. But it's again not it's not the huge growth that we see even around 2008 to 2010 when then China and so forth were still growing very, very rapidly. You would think that it would be with a moderate single-digit growth, the container shipping market would be quite healthy. In fact, the container shipping market is a mess. And it's a mess for the usual reasons, because container shipping companies buy too many ships. There are container shipping companies that make money, notably Maersk. I see that OOCL have announced at last some profits this quarter, but I won't mention any names. But nonetheless, the whole market is riddled with overcapacity. We can see here, I'm trying to remember, the green line is by how much capacity is growing in each sector and is in each trade. So we can see here each of the Africa trade, intra-Far East and so forth. You can see for most of that it's in double figures. And yet growth is growing, as we see before, only in low sort of single figures. I think the implications of that are fairly obvious. These are alpha liner figures, by the way. So I think you can imagine what that's going to have on prices. And we see, this is the Shanghai Shipping Index numbers. We can see that it's basically, for the past couple of years, stuck in a channel. In case of that purple line, I think that's China because the US, of around $2,000 per TEU. It's miserable. And most shipping companies, container shipping companies, struggle to make money on those numbers. That said, they have invested in brand new ships, vast ships. They've also got lower bunker fuel prices, and that has driven down the break-even point for most of them. And yet, even so, the smaller to middle-sized companies are often facing existential crisis. Speaking to major shippers, including automotive shippers, and they say, why don't the container shipping companies listen to me when I complain about the poor quality of service that we get? Well, the reason they don't listen is that they're so busy trying to keep their heads above water and trying to desperately grab every piece of business that they can get around the world that, frankly, they've got more important things to worry about than customers. So that's the state of the, I hope there's no container shipping people here, fleet sector. Air freight is very similar. The air freight companies are more disciplined in how they go about airlines, in how they manage capacity. However, particularly in the Middle East and to a lesser extent in the Far East, a lot of the big airlines have been investing very, very heavily in passenger-orientated sectors. That results in a huge amount of belly freight coming onto the market, and therefore they're not really aiming at the freight market, but the side effect is huge amounts of belly freight. The market is oversupplied and will probably remain so. Freighters are a declining proportion. The consequence is declining prices for air freight. We can also see, of course, that's complemented by the fact that crude oil price, which is a huge element, can be approaching half, well, it depends, of course, on the price of the oil, but of half of air freight costs, that's crashed. So, again, that's going to simply amplify the fact that you should be paying a lot less for air freight. Similarly, road freight in Europe. Road freight in Europe basically gone nowhere for several years in terms of pricing. If we look, these are Freightex figures. I would say that Freightex is Freight Exchange produces some of the few really reliable numbers on international movements in Europe. I crunched up some of their numbers last year and saw that even stripping out inflation, we've probably seen since 2010, actually since before that, but 2005, sorry, about a 16% increase in freight numbers. But that might sound impressive. It's pretty terrible. And of course, that takes into account the volatility-driven peaks in periods such as 2011. And we can see that since then, it's yo-yoed around with a lot of volatility around the channel, which is fairly miserable. So one might say that this will drive structural change in the future. It will strip out capacity. That may not be the case. But again, if you're buying freight, you probably shouldn't be looking at too much inflation. Although the big proviso is we have had a lot of volatility around those numbers. And a good example is Spain, where at one stage it was very, very difficult to get backloads out of Spain, such was the state, backloads into Spain, and thus stuff out of Spain, shoving up the price of Spanish freight. Fairly counterintuitive. So the macroeconomic picture can make life much more complicated. So it is not just a simple picture. Nonetheless, road freight's a fairly tough business to be in, I think, at the moment we can say. So similarly, a summary of the, hopefully you're all asleep by now, and I can go into the exciting slides, but we'll summarize them. Demand, as I say, is increasing in both international and also even in European road freight by a slow single-digit pace. I think we can fairly reasonably say. The US is probably picking up, and although that's a big statement to say it will take over from China, that very much depends on your opinions of the macroeconomic picture. But you might well note that US is becoming, perhaps edging towards its former position as the energizer bunny of the global market, and that's always true about the logistics market. There's chronic overcapacity in most transport markets. Container shipping's terrible. Air freight's it's slightly less bad. And as I say, you don't want to be in road freight if you can possibly avoid it. But, so that sounds a pretty boring picture. So hopefully you're all pretty bored and pretty depressed. But there is a lot of stuff going on in logistics. There is real dynamism in the sector. Logistics is a vast sector. 10% of global output is really logistics. Of course, the elephant, sorry, horrible phrase, but the elephant in the room of course, is the fact we have these colossal companies, and they are companies whose business is dominated by what is essentially a logistics model. Okay, I mean, these things dwarf most car manufacturers. Certainly in terms, the fulfillment expectation cost. Of course, Amazon doesn't like to break out how much it spends on logistics. It's a very secretive company, but it might well be 5 billion spend just on logistics. But when you actually look at their infrastructure, it's colossal, and it's not terribly surprising. Okay, but what this size and new business model and thus supply chain has led to is a rethinking about how to do logistics. Okay, Amazon is an excellent example because it has attempted to completely metamorphosize productivity. It's gone for these vast facilities, which are they are in regional markets. It's not, and we'll come on to this later. It's not serving customers from a global base. It's a regional market. It has a physical presence in each region, which acts as a key logistics node, even if the stuff is sourced globally, which is very important. But it's created huge economies of scale. And the reason it's aiming for huge economies of scale is so that it can utilize the sort of new technology, the new potential of both information technology, but in this case, in terms of hardware, let's call it robotics, automation. And it is remarkable the degree to which they use this stuff in contrast to most other sectors, logistics operations. I'm not talking about necessarily welding or the paint shop, but in terms of the quantity of automation that a company like Amazon is using. Of course, they're not the only ones to be using AGVs, but they use them on a scale, and therefore the ability to reclaim the capex that is really fairly unprecedented. So, and of course, they're an information business, if you like, a company that understands, however inadequately, that information is absolutely central to their business at all levels, and that drives logistics productivity. So I think it's a really important, salient thing that anyone in logistics has to pay attention to, which is the ability of these things to drive productivity. And it's probably very likely that these facilities are very, very productive as compared to most other comparable operations in other sectors. Doesn't by the mean necessarily that Amazon makes any money, but that's another aspect. Probably doesn't. A key part, other aspect of this is how transportation is used by the e-commerce sector. Okay, the e-commerce sector isn't just Amazon. Amazon has gone for one solution, but there is a whole other solution, other options that you can take. We know that there's a lot of, say, clothing retailers in the UK, for example, a very good example, clothing retailers that will sell globally to, not just to other markets in North America, and other developed markets, but even to emerging markets. So and they attempt to do that, rightly or wrongly, from a base in the UK. Now, to do this, you need a networked transport solution. You don't necessarily have to go for an air freight transport solution, but air freight is a very good way of doing that. Because remember, this is a revolution, because what it represents is an ability or an aspiration to access retail markets, individual private sector markets on a globalized basis as opposed to a localized basis. And therefore, the types of logistics solutions that are required are a quantum leap forward from what's existed before. So they're completely redesigning the sorts of conceptions of what we have as a supply chain. And the solution that's really adapted best to this is express parcels. And really, if we look at DHL Express, a company that was frankly having some problems, I can't be too rude, about them. I'm about to have a meeting with them after this presentation. But they were having some serious problems. Prior to this, huge chunk of their business collapsed in the US. They had massive write-offs. What they've been able to do is to understand the new market for logistics out there, of speed, of globalisation, of the efficiencies that network systems can deliver, and they have benefited enormously. Remember, if we look there, what they're aiming to do is by developing a network of capabilities in China, they're looking to reach into the Yangtze Valley and reach not just the production capabilities and pulling those production capabilities out, but actually to sell into that consumer base of basically 500 million people or more in the Yangtze Valley, and to offer to global retailers based, say, in Western countries, the ability to sell product into those markets. Okay, it's quite impressive. Okay, I'm running out of time. But as we can see, so what we have here is in these new conceptions, in these new business models of supply chain, of how supply chain works. They're very far from perfect, and I'll come from this, but they are characterized by a few underlying, they're often discrete, they're not explicit. I'm not saying these companies are necessarily perfectly run, they're not. But what we're saying is they do have information dynamics that offer them real potential. One of these is information on the customer. Remember, in terms of internet, you're going to have internet retailing of any type, you're going to have immediate feedback on the customer. You put a product out there in the marketplace, you know whether it sells within minutes. Okay, that's new. Okay, that demands a speed of response from the physical capabilities, as well as of the management structure as well. That, of course, means that you have to be able to move the information around your supply chain internally and externally. You've got to go to your suppliers and say, that sells, that doesn't sell. Make that, stop making that. And that's something measured in minutes. Now, as a rhetorical question, how long does that take the car industry to make those decisions? Okay, so, but also the ability to look at new cloud-based solutions, okay, in areas such as supply chain management, transportation management tools, okay? So the ability to manipulate cloud resources in order to bend the IT services to your requirements rather than the other way round is something which is absolutely transformative in terms of corporate strategy. I think that they sort of grasp this, sort of. But that probably makes them quite a bit ahead of most other sectors. I'm not saying that this sector, this e-commerce retailing sector is brilliant, because actually a large part of it are an absolute mess. The key problem is last mile delivery, which they haven't got their heads around. But even that's Alibaba, okay? Alibaba is probably bigger in terms of capitalization at the moment than Walmart, and yet that's the reality we see on that photograph, the reality of much of logistics in China. So, you know, this is a very problematic sector, but it's certainly one you have to pay attention to if you want new ideas. So, what can we learn? As I say, globalization. And let's not fool ourselves. Okay, these are global corporations that are VMs, but we all know that the VMs still look very much to have local supply chains. And I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong for the VMs, but we can say that globalization, certain people have grasped that drives huge increases in productivity. Amazon can sell you cheap stuff like this because it's sourced, or they have the ability to source on a huge scale and at a global scale. That means cheaper products, higher productivity. These businesses are absolutely plugged in to information and with a direct interface into customers. That must be surely a huge driver of productivity and advantage. And that they have been able to, or they have been able to pragmatically perhaps, but adapt transportation to these challenges. They really understand the centrality of information in productivity. So this is another chopped off, we've been truncated slide we've got here, but basically what I've tried to do here is let's look at compare and contrast. I think in terms of operational quality between e-commerce operators and automotive, operational quality is better. I've been around, warehouses with sofas piled up, with warehouses belonging to e-commerce operations with furniture and sofas piled up with biro-written notes stuffed on them, said "do not touch" and all this stuff. That's often the reality of many logistics operations in e-commerce. You don't see that in very many vehicle manufacturers or other automotive operations. So operational quality and integrity is probably higher. But information as a strategic resource, that's got to be e-commerce. Really, is that really grasped so strongly in automotive? I'm not so sure. Global economies of scale, I'm not saying they don't exist in the automotive sector, but I think, again, e-commerce, that's a strategic asset rather than a tactical asset. And in terms of understanding exactly the requirements of customers, the ability to understand that, to take that information and process that, drive that right down the organization, out to your suppliers, to tier X, whatever it is, and to do that at the speed of light, again, surely that's e-commerce. And I think those are just dealing with some of those issues. Okay, it's not the same type, it's not retailing, although you are retailing motor cars in the end. Okay, I'm not saying these sectors are exactly the same, but I think there are things there that the automotive sector can really learn from. Okay, so hopefully you're all asleep there by now and have forgotten everything that I've said.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and it was good to have a speaker. He was true to his word. He was boring. No, they're very interesting presentation. They're looking at the logistics market and especially the comparison with the e-commerce world, which is already having and will have an even greater impact on the automotive and therefore the logistics industries. So we've had two presentations there. One maybe particularly focusing on the automotive industry and the global growth and some of the issues. A focus also on the logistics and some of the challenges that you'll all face. So we haven't got so much time for questions, but we will give you the opportunity to ask some questions. So the usual rules apply, especially because of the Automotive Logistics Live format. So please raise your hand, wait for the microphone, say your name and your company name, and then ask the question or make your comment, whichever you want to do. There's also, if you're using the Automotive Logistics Live, you can post a question or make a comment by using that, and I can see the questions that come up. So please feel free to use that mode, although of course the preference for all is if the discussion is held kind of live and by asking the question yourself. So I don't know if anyone wants to kick off the questions. So, okay, there's a question right at the front. And just before we get to that question, for those of you who don't know, Thomas Cullen was a previous editor of Automotive Logistics magazine and played a great role in raising the profile and making automotive logistics what it is. So that must surely be your proudest moment, Thomas.
Yes, thank you.
And also a warning to Christopher, our current editor, that's probably what you're going to look like in a few years' time, Chris.
Well, okay, that's why I'm growing the beard now. I can sort of compensate for the hair that should go on top at some point. I have a couple of questions. Maybe start with Christoph. Looking at the production capacity picture in Europe, because obviously over the past few years, we've talked about overcapacity, and you mentioned that obviously there's oversupply to a certain extent. You seem to predict maybe even a new plant in Europe over the next 5-6 years. So how would you define the production capacity situation now, and how do you see that developing? Is it sort of sorted out? Do we still have problems? Might we still need to see a plant close somewhere, for example?
That's a very tricky question because it's both political and a very local problem. Because, as we know, automotive factories are very closely wed to the products that they make. So when you have a product that sells well, you have a factory that's well utilized, and when you have a product that's a bit of a problem, your factory has a problem. And it's very, very hard and very costly to interchange that, and you don't do that at, let's say, minute speed, but you do that in years. So it's a very patchy picture. You have some factories that are bursting by the seams, some of them luckily in southern Germany. Other factories are pretty empty, and some of them in Italy, some still in Spain, some still in France. So you can't say in general. It's really a question not so much for the economist, but for the account manager to understand the current situation of the individual OEM, of the individual factory of the OEM, and to understand if the OEM has a good product or a good product strategy at hand that may make it probable that the factory is going to host a successful product in the near future. In terms of general total statistics, we think the problem still exists on an average level. In terms of factory closing, the era of outright open factory closing is now pretty much, let's say this round of factory closing is now pretty much over, and those of you who are reading the newspaper, demolishing works have started in Bochum, which caused another outcry and outrage in the region. I don't think it's a very sensitive thing to do, but okay, still needed to be done. Clear the space for a logistics center. So maybe that's the state that we're going to see. So as a there is no general problem. Overcapacity is never a general issue. It is always a local issue, and ultimately it's always a product problem.
Thank you. And Thomas, obviously comparing the automotive and e-commerce worlds at the end there, and how e-commerce arguably leverages a really global supply chain. Are there examples in automotive that you would point to that actually are doing that? I mean, I have in mind maybe spare parts where there are some huge global source warehouses which arguably maybe do distribute more globally. Maybe Daimler, for example, out of Germany. But do you see any examples where this kind of is happening more?
There are examples where components, tier one components, are sourced globally. The problem is it's very difficult to do that because the logistics systems aren't set up to manage that. But it's a very difficult thing to manage anyway. But if you're managing, you see, this is the thing. If you're putting it into a shipping container, you don't know when that, down to the last hour, you don't know when that shipping container is going to arrive. Okay, so you're going to have a gap there of uncertainty, a period of uncertainty, probably of weeks, conceivably. If you go for the daily Maersk service, it's going to be within 48 hours. It's going to be pretty workable. If not, you're not sure when stuff's going to turn up. So that's a major constraint on operating, on sourcing at a global level. And I think the answer is the model is not a global one. The model is not a global one. The structure, the conception is not a global one. So you will have to change that conception if you want. Now, there are people, I remember you having a conversation with BMW saying, I don't need to source globally. I have the option if I want middle income production locations, I can source in Central Europe. Okay. And in many respects, they're forced to do that. Okay. So it is a big jump. I'm not denying that.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, a couple of questions from my side. Firstly, to Christoph, just on the alternative drivetrains, electric cars in particular, what are your, there's a big trend towards that. What are your forecasts for the growth? It hasn't quite grown as much as everybody would like.
Well, it's a paradox picture. It's a local phenomenon. We have very local markets that are already quite developed for electric vehicles. Unfortunately, very small places like Norway, places like the Netherlands, places like some spots in California. It's not yet a global phenomenon, but the automotive industry has invested a lot of money into it. So with a low oil price, it will take some refocusing of what an electric car actually should be in the future in order to get it to become a more lively market. Our forecast is still that with the CO2 targets that the automotive manufacturers are facing, they cannot do without electric vehicles. But maybe they will have to do away with a sort of slimmed down, low-featured kind of cheapy kind of electric vehicles. They have to make them really interesting, really fascinating. But that is going to take them a while. So our forecast is still there's no way around electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids. The question is what type of vehicles do we actually need in order to make the market work?
Okay. And a question to Thomas. The last time you spoke, you were saying you were comparing automotive to other industries, and was very critical of the automotive industry. So if you've got any rocks there, have them ready, please. How do you think we've looked at e-commerce, which is a different thing, and there's a lot we can learn from e-commerce. But how is automotive developing in contrast to other manufacturing or traditional industries?
No, I mean, it's undoubtedly the case that the automotive industry, on the traditional benchmarks, if you like, is very high quality. Okay, and a lot of, I would say most other sectors look to the automotive sector and say, can you tell us what's going on in the automotive sector because we think that's the best. And in many respects, many respects, particularly operational, but also tactical, I think they're correct. And we look at that, and I'm not saying there isn't innovation. Please, people, I'm not saying there isn't innovation in the automotive logistics sector. And we see important innovations. I mean, for example, I was looking at Nissan have just built that large logistics center for specific reasons in order to expand their supply chain geography. Okay, on a European basis, not necessarily on a global basis, although Nissan does source a quarter of some of its components, the components for some of its models on a global basis. So I think that's the sort of thing that you'd be doing. But overall, I would say that the car industry, compared to most other comparable sectors, is of very high quality.
Okay, thank you. And it's good to know that physical intimidation can have an impact on people's opinions of an industry. Right, a question in the middle there, please.
Morning, Mark Ellis from Geodis. When we talk about innovation, I think some of us may have been watching the news sometime this week, and there's some very, very brave people, in my view, that's flying a plane around the world based on solar power. That they're trying to go around the world in the next 5 months, and I think they're in the middle now of a 5-day flight, and good luck to them. I'm not sure that we'll get to a stage where we can have solar-powered cars, particularly where I'm from in the UK, because I don't think we get enough sun. But my question for the panel is that 15 years ago, automotive was seen as we used to call it the rocket science of logistics. It was everyone used to look at automotive as being the benchmark in setting their standards within the supply chain. Where do you think it ranks now?
Is that one for me?
You're the logistics guy.
It's for both of you. Don't duck, Chris. It's for both.
I wouldn't call it the rocket science anymore, if you like. So things like, I mean, you think, in the 1980s we were, just in time and all this sort of stuff. That was cutting edge. It would be untrue to say it's cutting edge. It's still very high quality, but it's high quality on a much more conventional model. And I think, again, I think the impact of technology on all this is going to be huge, because we see the nature of the motor car changing, and the car industry will have to adapt. I still think there is innovation at the tactical level, at the operational level. There is real innovation there. I'm not saying that. But at the strategic conception of what manufacturing is, okay, the Germans have this concept of Industrial Revolution 4, okay, that Siemens and Bosch and so forth are pushing. Okay, now if we scale that up to the supply chain strategically, I'm not quite sure it would be fair to say that the automotive sector is leading there. I'm being very cautious there.
Let me just add a little bit more to that. And you said you liked controversy before.
I don't like controversy at all.
Do you think that part of the demise, if you like, in the automotive industry supply chain coming from the top and maybe moving down a level or two, do you think part of this is down to the innovation from the providers, from the 3PLs and 4PLs, that innovation is being tempered by the OEMs and tier ones now becoming far more price conscious?
Yeah, I know what you're saying, and it is very interesting. I know what you're saying. There is a lot of ideas amongst the LSPs, and OEMs, I'm trying to be as vague as possible here, are often very resistant to taking on these ideas, and you're absolutely right, they do wallop people on. I mean, when they look at you guys, they think, here's somebody who just wants to shove his price up. Okay, I don't deny that, and I don't deny that the vehicle manufacturers probably ought to listen more to logistics service providers. But in terms of their technology, they are still metal bashers. A core part of their business is still metal bashing, and that determines the dynamics of the supply chain. Okay, when that changes, that all bets are off. Okay, so but still, on a day-to-day basis, what these companies are constrained by, they would say, is, look, I have to make this type of motor car. Okay, and okay, you're coming to me as an LSP, you could do it this way, you can do that way. Look, I'll tell you, I'm the customer. I have to solve my production line problems, or I have to solve my dealership problems, whatever it is. When the technology changes, and you look at that car sitting on the forecourt, and it is different. It's made in a different way, and it will have a different type of supply chain, and that's only the beginning. So that is, to be honest, at the strategic level, that's what's going to drive change. And the logistics providers who understand that and know how to adapt, then they will benefit.
Well, maybe from the other way around. I think the problems that the automotive industry were identified for the automotive industry like 10, 20 years ago, they have been solved. So the big problem of cars that were rusting, the big problem of parts falling off, the big problem of cars not being manufactured in the right way are pretty much solved. And I think the industry is now looking for a new vision. And what I've been sort of not discussing too much here is that the auto industry itself is in lack of a vision, and they look to the software industry, they look to the data industry for a new role model of what it is that they want to become in the future. And when they have established their new model for themselves, they will find a new way of approaching service providers to provide solutions to help them really instate the new role model and their new vision that they have for themselves. But they're not quite there yet, and they're quite busy thinking about things themselves.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we've run out of time for the questions now. I'd like to thank the panel for giving us plenty of food for thought for the next 2 days. We will be splitting into 3 rooms, so please take your belongings with you. We'll be in, this room will stay is finished vehicle logistics. Session 2 or track B will be in another room across by where the restaurant and breakfast rooms are. And in just further down the corridor will be track C on the aftermarket. So please join those. We've got Daimler, Nissan, Ford, Jaguar Land Rover, Renault, Nissan, Adam Opel and Amazon spread out over those 3 sessions. So make sure you join those sessions and join us for the coffee now hosted by Jeffco. Thank you.